that was, balanced expenditure and revenue, you'd be telling us how many tens of thousands of jobs we were going to lose.
Bill, isn't there more bad news to come around housing prices, though? You're looking here at another 12% drop in nominal house prices over the next 2 years. How concerned are you about that?
I've been saying for some time there is some risk in this economy that you get some negative feedback between rising unemployment and a negative effect on house prices. So when middle income people lose their jobs, it certainly has an effect on the local housing market. Now, in some countries that has turned into a very negative feedback loop. We are hopeful it won't happen in New Zealand. Housing prices are still out of line with their long run average, and they'll either stay where they are for a long time or they'll drop back a bit. It's anyone's guess. There seems to be some anecdotal evidence of recovery and interest in the housing market.
Mr. English, I remember when Treasury outlined its decade of deficits back in December, you said that that was unacceptable to the government. And yet it does seem at least that the cash deficit is going to continue right through until up to 2019. And I'm just wondering whether or not you think perhaps you could have been bolder in getting that down faster. I mean, that's still an awfully long time for the government to be running deficits every year.
Yes, it is a long time, and we believe we have struck the right balance between supporting jobs and economic activity in the short term in the bottom of a sharp and unexpected recession on the one hand, and giving ourselves time in the longer term to lift our economic performance, which would close up those deficits sooner. We haven't, in this budget, tried to solve all these problems at once. It is one of the benefits of New Zealand having relatively low debt levels. We've got time to make some considered decisions now in a way that would avoid harsher decisions later on.
Mr. English, what are the differences between the Primary Growth Partnership and the previous government's Fast Forward Fund?
The difference is, there's technical differences in how it's funded. The main difference is the transparency of the government's contribution. So we've just made it quite clear that this is not about some phantom $700 million or $2 billion fairy tale. This is about 70 million of hard cash on the table, which will be given out if the primary sector can match it dollar for dollar.
Over here, Bill. Will you be able to maintain extra spending on health at $750 million a year under your new $1.1 billion new spending allocation?
Well, clearly there's going to be a bit more pressure on health and education. Both have had increases in the area of 6 to 8% per annum for the last 6 or 7 years. That is likely to slow down, but we've just finished writing the 2009 budget. We're not going to start writing the 2010 budget today.
Mr. English, looking at the home insulation scheme, during those first 2 years of its operation, I wonder if those 180,000 homes that will be eligible, what take-up rate you're expecting and what number of jobs will be created?
You'd be best to address those questions directly to the Minister of Energy, Mr Brownlee, or to the Greens. I think it's a bit speculative just how many people will take it up. There's been a serious attempt to simplify the existing schemes and make them more accessible, and we will find out just how many people will take them up. With respect to jobs, we haven't tried to make spurious estimates about how many jobs particular policies support. As a whole, though, by the time you implement the insulation program, the infrastructure investment across schools and housing and roading, and maintain and in some places expand public services, for instance, there's 600 extra police and another 300 or 400 extra probation officers in this budget, then you're talking about supporting tens of thousands of jobs.
Mr. English, do you seriously think that you can announce a reinstatement of those tax cuts before the next election, given we've got a decade of deficits ahead of us?
Do we seriously think?
You can announce the reinstatement of those tax cuts before the next election, given the decade of deficits ahead?
That's quite unlikely.
So you're saying it's unlikely there'll be an announcement of tax cuts before the election?
That's right, it's unlikely. There would need to be magnificently better economic performance than what's forecast today.
And do you think there's a risk with all this borrowing that's announced today that interest rates, particularly on longer-term mortgages, could be pushed up by what's in this budget?
Look, any increase in public debt is going to have some crowding out effects on private sector activity. That is why we need to continue to work at getting the government debt requirement down. Today is a first step. It's taken the top off what would have been a pretty deathly spiral of debt growth. But the job certainly isn't over. In the next couple of years, you're going to see corporates, banks out there trying to borrow. We don't want to be making it any harder for them than it already is.
Bill, this budget doesn't, I think it was been addressed by some of the other questions as well before, doesn't really address how productivity gains are intended to be achieved. Is it fair to say that this is sort of more of an attempt to try and balance the books or make them a little bit less unpleasant than they looked, and that you're going to start looking at changing economic settings in future budgets? Because there's not... I mean, is there much here that we can really genuinely expect productivity gains to come out of?
Yes, there are a number of things. The thing with productivity is that there isn't a silver bullet, otherwise it would have been in each of the last 15 budgets. To increase our productivity, we need to do about 200 things right, not just one. This budget starts a process in two respects. One, the investment in infrastructure is strongly focused on productivity-related infrastructure. For instance, our transport bottlenecks, and we've committed $1 billion extra to the roading program. We've also begun a thorough regulatory review, and the list is laid out in the budget, ranging from the Overseas Investment Act through to all aspects of water management, because at the core of our export capacity is our comparative advantage in water. And everyone agrees it needs sorted out. A lot of that stuff is not glamorous, but it's vital. And you'll be hearing more from the government on productivity-related policy through the next 12 months.
Mr. English, you said there was a choice really of breaking a promise on tax or a promise on spending. I wonder if you could explain the rationale that you went for breaking promise on tax, which National has always campaigned for, as opposed to some of the spending promises like interest-free loans for students, which you originally opposed. You did promise both in the election. Why did you make the decision to defer or cancel the tax promise as opposed to some of the spending promises?
Look, I think we have all been surprised by the ferocious nature of the recession. You only have to look at the rapid rise in unemployment, which has reached around 1,000 a week, to be concerned about that. And the depth, the strength of that impact has brought our focus much more onto getting through the trough of this recession, providing a sense of security, underwriting those people who aren't in a position to do much about their situation, and maintaining the public services. And that's a choice we've made.
Finally, you've said the government still has a medium-term goal of 30% top rate across the board. Can you define medium-term?
No, I can't. We've had trouble defining the short term over the last few months. Just look at how quickly the forecasts have changed. Any further